A cold Atlantic wind moves down Bellevue Avenue before the town fully wakes. In Newport, the winter light arrives thin and colorless, flattening stone into a single tone. The lawns are empty. The hedges hold their shape. Behind iron and carved masonry, a facade rises with the confidence of a country that once believed money could be poured into architecture and come back out as permanence. The house is called a cottage, only because the people who built it needed a smaller word for what they were doing. A long drive curves toward a set of doors made for processions. Window after window, each one cut to the same rhythm, each one implying that the interior has been organized, not for comfort, but for control. 70 rooms, a plan that separates the visible world from the working world. Corridors meant to hide movement, staircases meant to reveal it, and, in the quiet, you can hear the real scale of the place, not footsteps, but systems. Heat has to be held inside stone. Roof lines have to be watched. Metal has to be kept from salt air. Wood has to be kept from moisture. Even when no one is living here, the building still consumes attention. It still requires labor. It still demands money simply to remain itself. That is what makes it strange. By the middle of the 20th century, this kind of private throne should have failed outright, sold, stripped, subdivided, forgotten. Instead, it survived by changing its meaning. The breakers did not remain powerful because a family held it. It remained powerful because it stopped being private. In 1948, the doors began to open to strangers with tickets. And in 1972, the most symbolic act arrived. Not a fire, not a scandal, but a transaction. The estate moved out of dynastic hands and into an institution built to preserve what the dynasty could no longer carry. The question is not why the Vanderbilts built it. The question is what kind of city, economy, and social machinery made building it feel rational in the first place. Newport begins as a location before it becomes a symbol, a deep-water harbor cut into the edge of Rhode Island, a coastline that offers both shelter and access. In 1639, English colonists established the settlement on Aquidneck Island, and for generations the place makes sense in the most practical way. It sits on roots. It can receive cargo. It can send it back out. It can connect inland farms to Atlantic markets without pretending to be a frontier. It is, early on, a working port town before it ever learns how to perform elegance. The harbor does the first kind of work that creates durable wealth, steady, repeatable movement of goods and people. Shipping, warehouses, insurance, credit, the quiet arithmetic of trade that looks boring when it functions and catastrophic when it breaks. And it does break. In the late 18th century, Newport is pulled into Imperial War and then National Revolution. During the American Revolutionary War, British forces occupy the town for years. People leave. Commerce fractures. Buildings are commandeered. Money migrates. When peace arrives, Newport remains standing, but the logic that once made it prosperous has shifted elsewhere, toward faster-growing ports and new interior corridors. That early rise and decline matters, because it leaves behind a town with a peculiar profile, old enough to have inherited streets and houses, small enough to feel contained, wounded enough to have space. A place with scenery and existing architecture, but without a booming industrial engine that would otherwise cover the coastline in factories. By the 19th century, Newport's advantage is not what it produces. It is what it offers to people who produce elsewhere. The industrial cities of the Northeast, New York, Boston, Philadelphia, are dense, loud, and hot in summer. Their wealth is real, but it is physically uncomfortable. Coal smoke, crowded tenements, disease cycles that still move faster than medicine. For families with means, health becomes a logistics problem. How to relocate the household seasonally, where to send children, where to place servants, how to move trunks and linens and silver without turning travel into chaos. Newport's climate solves part of that. The ocean moderates temperature. Breezes push through open land. The coastline is dramatic without being remote. It is close enough to the big cities to feel connected, far enough to feel separate. And in the 19th century, close enough becomes a moving target that technology keeps shrinking. Steamboats and improved coastal travel make the trip more dependable. Rail lines and connectors tighten the schedule. By the time the late century arrives, a wealthy household can treat distance like an inconvenience rather than a barrier. Travel becomes routine enough that it can be built into the calendar. Summer season as a fixed social migration rather than a risky expedition. The calendar is where Newport's second life truly begins. Once the town becomes a seasonal destination, it starts attracting more than visitors. It attracts systems that exist to serve visitors with money: hotels, stables, carriage services, caterers, florists, tailors, builders, gardeners, security, domestic labor recruited from other places and housed discreetly near the homes that employ them. A resort economy is not leisurely for the people who run it. It is an industrial schedule disguised as ease. In this world, the summer home isn't simply a private retreat, it's a platform. If you are a wealthy family in the Northeast, you already have a city residence. That is where business is conducted, where proximity to banks and brokers and attorneys matters. But the city home has a problem. Too many people can be near it. Its status competes with other status in the same blocks. Its grandeur has to share the street. Newport offers something the city cannot: separation as prestige. A house here sits on land with air around it, a driveway that forces approach to be slow, views that make visitors feel small before a word is spoken. This is not architecture as shelter. It is architecture as social engineering. The very geography helps. Along Bellevue Avenue and the roads that branch from it, estates begin to line up like declarations. They do not need to be in the center of commerce. They need to be seen by the right people at the right times. They need to be reachable by carriage, close enough to each other to sustain a circuit of visits, dinners, teas, dances, close enough that the elite can be physically clustered, yet spread out enough that each house can claim its own dominance. That cluster becomes a machine for making hierarchy feel natural. Newport's social season develops its own infrastructure: clubs, sporting events, churches attended by families whose names function like credentials. Yachting becomes a visible demonstration of leisure that requires enormous capital and labor. Tennis, golf, and riding appear not simply as hobbies, but as rituals that separate those who have time from those who do not. Even the architecture starts speaking in a shared language: stone, columns, terraces, balustrades, European forms transplanted to American shorelines to make new money feel old. The term cottage evolves inside that world as a kind of social lie. It implies something temporary, modest, even wholesome, when many of these houses are larger than the permanent residences of previous generations' elites. The word matters because it softens what is otherwise obvious. These are palaces constructed in a republic that still claims to distrust palaces. And there is always another reason behind the vocabulary: to justify expense. By the late 19th century, building at Newport is not only about comfort, it's about conversion. A family takes industrial money, earned in rail corridors, factory chains, financial markets, and converts it into cultural legitimacy. The house becomes a physical argument. We belong among the permanent. To make that argument, you need more than a facade. You need an army. These places require carpenters, masons, plasterers, and painters. They require interior designers, cabinet makers, upholsterers. They require specialized materials shipped from far away and the networks to obtain them. They require imported stone, custom ironwork, glass, and textiles. They require landscape architects and crews that can reshape land the way earlier elites shaped it in Europe, moving earth, planting trees that will not look mature for decades, building walls and paths and gardens that signal patience, one of the most expensive virtues there is. And then, after the construction, the real cost begins. A great house is not a single expenditure. It is a permanent operating expense. Heat, lighting, repairs, replacement, repainting. Roofs, gutters, salt air corroding metal, moisture swelling wood, storms testing every seam, servant wages, kitchen supplies, laundry, stable maintenance, security. The house becomes less like a residence and more like a private institution that happens to have bedrooms. That is why Newport's Gilded Age is not just a story of taste. It is a story of management. Only a specific type of wealth can support this. Wealth that is not merely inherited land, but continuously replenished by systems large enough to feed a mansion year after year. The kind of money that arrives on schedules, backed by corporations, tied to networks that run across states and rail junctions and ports. Newport becomes the place where those systems go to rest, without ever truly resting. The town begins to reflect the contradiction of the era, a country that is industrializing at high speed while building aristocratic stages on its shoreline, a republic producing private monarchies for the summer, a modern economy creating buildings that look like they were always supposed to exist. And that is the real setup. Before we ever reach a single family, we need to understand what Newport had become by the 1890s. A coastline wired into national capital, a social season run like a schedule, and a landscape where the richest Americans competed not with words, but with stone. Because once that system is in place, one kind of fortune is almost destined to arrive and treat the town as if it were built for them. By the time the 1890s arrive, America's richest families are no longer improvising their wealth. They are administering it. The country is stitched together by rails, and the rails are not just transportation. They are a private grid laid over public land, rights of way negotiated, towns pulled toward depots, whole regions reorganized around timetables. Whoever controls those lines controls the pacing of commerce, coal, steel, grain, passengers, mail, perishable goods that now have deadlines. This is how money becomes continuous. Not a fortune sitting in a vault, but revenue moving in cycles. In New York, that system concentrates around names that become shorthand for logistics itself. The Vanderbilt fortune begins with steamship and rail consolidation in the mid-19th century, but by the late century its scale depends on corporate management, boards, capital expenditures, labor disputes, rate wars, regulation rising at the edges. This is not the old model of land and rent. It is modern wealth. Large, mechanical, vulnerable to markets, and powerful precisely because it can move. Newport, meanwhile, has become the place where modern wealth tries to look timeless. The families who build there are responding to a paradox. Railroad and industrial money is vast, but it is also new. It lacks the patina of inherited estates. Newport offers a solution that is almost architectural. If you cannot inherit centuries, you can manufacture the impression of them, using the only material your era reliably provides, capital. And then a fire makes the choice unavoidable. On the night of September 25, 1892, the earlier breakers, an existing Newport house owned by the same branch of the family, burns. The cause is commonly traced to a fault in the building's systems, and the lesson is not sentimental. It is technical. A wooden mansion, no matter how grand, is still fuel. In a district built for permanence, fire exposes the truth. Many of these palaces are temporary by design because they were erected quickly to match a seasonal calendar and a social arms race. What happens next is not an emotional rebuilding. It is an upgrade. Plans are commissioned almost immediately, and the new house is approached like a project that cannot fail. The architect is Richard Morris Hunt, the most sought-after designer of elite American domestic power in that era, trained in Europe, fluent in historical styles, and practical enough to run construction at scale. Construction begins in 1893, and by 1895 the new breakers stands finished. Enormous, formal, and deliberately engineered to resist the vulnerability that destroyed its predecessor. The material choices are part of the message. Stone replaces wood as the dominant surface. Interior structure is built around fire-resistant logic, metal framing, masonry partitions, fewer hidden voids where flames can travel unseen. Even the roof and service areas are treated as technical zones, not romantic spaces. A house like this is not built to feel safe. It is built to survive as evidence. The scale is calculated, not accidental. Roughly 70 rooms, organized with a clarity that makes hierarchy feel like architecture. Public rooms arranged for procession. Entrances, halls, dining spaces, drawing rooms, each one large enough to hold crowds without seeming crowded. Private family quarters set apart, protected by distance and doors. Service corridors and back stairs threaded through the plan so labor can move continuously without being seen. The house is a machine that hides its own mechanism, and like any machine, it needs infrastructure. By the 1890s, elite houses are becoming hybrid organisms, old-world style laid over modern utilities. Electric lighting is no longer an experiment, it is expected. Plumbing is complex enough to support multiple bathrooms, kitchens, laundry, and staff facilities. Heating is centralized. Communication inside the building, bells, speaking tubes, call systems, turns servants into a coordinated network. Refrigeration, storage, and food logistics become their own discipline, because dinners are not just meals, they are events timed to social expectation. The Breakers is designed to run as a seasonal institution, which means it must be capable of switching on. Summer arrives, the household arrives, and the building has to become fully operational in days. That requires staff, dozens of workers whose names rarely appear in the family narrative but whose routines make the narrative possible. Housekeepers, footmen, cooks, laundresses, gardeners, drivers, stable hands, schedules, inventories, linen counts, silver polishing, ice deliveries, fuel, and supplies. Even leisure has a supply chain. The interiors amplify the purpose. The grand rooms are not built simply to be beautiful, they are built to be convincing. Classical orders, carved ornament, monumental fireplaces, ceilings that borrow European vocabulary. This is a form of cultural translation. Industrial era, money translated into the language of inherited authority. Guests may not understand the financial instruments behind the fortune, but they understand marble, symmetry, and scale. They understand the implication that the household is not merely rich, it is ordained. But the deeper truth is that the same forces that allow this house to be built are also the forces that will make it harder to keep. The Gilded Age produces wealth quickly, and it produces costs that follow it. Labor becomes organized. Taxes rise and change shape. Public opinion begins to harden against extravagance even as it cannot look away from it. Financial cycles become less forgiving. A fortune tied to national systems, rails, markets, corporate policy, can grow enormous, and then face pressures that land-based aristocracies once avoided by simply waiting out the decade. So when people look at the Breakers and see a monument, the more accurate description is an operating system. It is a private structure that depends on public-scale wealth to function. It is designed to appear permanent, but it lives on continuous replenishment, money, staff, repairs, and a social world that still agrees the performance matters. Because once a house like this exists, the story is no longer only about why it was built. It becomes about what it cost to keep the throne standing, year after year, until the arithmetic finally changes. Power in Newport was rarely announced. It was arranged. In a city built around a summer calendar, the strongest households did not need offices downtown. Their authority lived in patterns: who received invitations, whose carriage stopped at which gate, who was seated near whom, who was seen arriving and leaving at the right hours. The public could read the season the way it read headlines. Certain doors opened more often than others. Certain names traveled faster than weather. The Breakers was not simply a residence inside that system. It was an instrument that stabilized it. A house of this size turns private choices into visible facts. It requires an operation large enough to employ dozens of people directly and many more indirectly: laundries, deliveries, gardeners, builders, repairmen, stables, caterers, florists. When such a household expands for the summer, it pulls labor into orbit. Wages and routines radiate outward into the town's economy. And because those jobs depend on discretion and reliability, employment becomes its own quiet ladder: who is trusted, who is recommended, who is kept. Inside the social world, the mansion functions the same way. The rooms are designed for movement through hierarchy: arrivals in view, departures observed, thresholds that separate the merely invited from the intimately included. A dinner in a house like this isn't just hospitality. It's a controlled environment where reputation is manufactured. The guest list becomes a map of influence, and the spaces themselves, hall, drawing room, dining room, work like stages that make status appear effortless. Even distance becomes a tool. The long approach, the formal frontage, the scale of the facade, each element slows visitors down and sets their posture before a word is spoken. Power is partly psychological. The building does that work without needing a person to do it. It makes guests adjust their tone, and it makes families without such architecture feel their absence. In a republic that claims not to have aristocracy, Newport builds one anyway: seasonal, informal, and ruthlessly measured. The Breakers doesn't invent that system. It confirms it. And once power is confirmed in stone, the next question is always the same: how is it paid for, and what happens when payment becomes harder? Wealth in the Gilded Age looked like certainty. In practice, it behaved like a moving target. A railroad-era fortune is not a chest of gold. It is ownership in systems: stock, bonds, land, terminals, rolling equipment, contracts, debt structured to build more debt, revenue that depends on passenger demand and freight rates and national cycles. On paper, such a fortune can appear permanent. In reality, it is tied to the same volatility as the country itself. The Breakers is what happens when that kind of wealth tries to become solid. To build an estate on this scale, money has to do two things at once. First, it must fund construction: labor, materials, shipping, finishing, design. Second, it must continue to exist afterward because the building immediately becomes a yearly obligation. Staff must be paid. Repairs must be constant. Utilities must be maintained. Grounds must be managed like acreage in a small municipality. Salt air does not respect reputations. Storms do not negotiate. The mansion, therefore, turns a family fortune into a recurring test. At the height of the Gilded Age, the test feels easy because cash is flowing. The household can treat expense as atmosphere, something present but not acknowledged. In that environment, a mansion is less a drain than a declaration. We can carry this, which implies we can carry anything. But wealth changes shape across generations. A founder's era is usually the moment of fastest expansion. Later generations inherit a different landscape: more regulation, different tax structures, changing labor markets, social pressure rising against overt display, and markets that can wipe out value quickly. Even when the family remains rich, liquidity matters. The ability to turn assets into cash without destroying the base becomes the difference between still owning and still controlling. That is where the tragedy is hidden, not in a sudden fall, but in slow conversion. A house like the Breakers is an asset that rarely behaves like one. It cannot be downsized. It cannot be easily rented without surrendering privacy. It cannot be cheaply paused. Most of its cost is simply the price of standing still. So the longer time runs, the more the mansion turns from trophy into equation, an inheritance that demands management, not reverence. And once an inheritance becomes an equation, architecture starts to matter in a new way. Not as beauty, but as burden engineered into every wall. The Breakers was built to defeat one specific enemy: fire. In the autumn of 1892, the previous house on the site was destroyed. The lesson was blunt. Wood burns. Drafts pull flame through hidden cavities. A large domestic staff, constant cooking, lighting, heating systems, and a building packed with textiles and finishes create risk that no amount of prestige can eliminate. So the new construction becomes a response that is as technical as it is theatrical. Richard Morris Hunt designs a palace in the Neo-Italian Renaissance vocabulary. Formal, symmetrical, confident, referencing old European authority while operating with modern American resources. It is meant to look inevitable, as if it has always belonged on that coastline. But underneath the style is an engineering choice: durability as status. Materials and structure are selected with resistance in mind. Brick and masonry, extensive stone, metal elements intended to limit fire's ability to race through the building. The plan is disciplined. Monumental public rooms arranged for ceremony, private spaces separated, service areas designed for high-volume household logistics. The house is not merely large. It is organized like an institution. And institutional buildings have a distinctive trait: they never stop costing money. Every design feature that makes the house convincing also makes it expensive to preserve. Stone facades require constant inspection and repair. Roof lines, gutters, chimneys, each becomes a maintenance schedule. Interiors designed to overwhelm the eye are filled with surfaces that require specialized care: carved detail, gilding, heavy fabrics, polished wood, metalwork. Even the very choice to build big multiplies cost by multiplying area: more flooring to protect, more windows to maintain, more rooms to heat, more points where water and salt can enter and quietly destroy. The architecture also bakes hierarchy into the building's circulation. Hidden corridors and back stairs allow servants to move continuously without disrupting the performance. That separation is elegant for guests and punishing for operations. It means more passageways, more doors, more wear, more staff required simply to keep things invisible. The breakers is often admired as if it were a sculpture, but it is more accurately understood as a machine, built to display power and wealth and then to consume them in order to remain displayed. And once you see the mansion that way, the remaining angles become unavoidable because the building does not exist alone. It exists inside a social order, a political order, and an economic reality that will eventually decide whether the throne can remain private at all. The breakers was designed to look effortless. Effortlessness in Newport was the highest luxury. That illusion required a second population living inside the same walls, a workforce whose movements were engineered to be unseen. The house separates space the way it separates status. Guests move through broad corridors, grand staircases, rooms built for arrival and display. Staff move through narrower routes, service passages, backstairs, doors placed so close to ornament that most visitors never register them as entrances at all. This is not an accident of design. It is a moral architecture. A mansion like this depends on labor that cannot be allowed to appear as labor. Meals arrive without visible preparation. Rooms reset without visible hands. Fires burn without visible fuel. Clothing reappears without visible washing. The household runs like a theater where the stagehands are never permitted to cross into the spotlight. That hierarchy extends beyond the building. Newport's summer season creates a seasonal labor economy that pulls in workers from elsewhere and then releases them again. Domestic service becomes a pipeline: hired, trained, replaced, referred. The estate's stability depends on the reliability of people whose own lives remain unstable, whose time is broken into shifts and tasks measured by bells, schedules, and the unspoken rule that the household's needs outrank private needs. Inside the breakers, even silence is structured. There are rooms built to impress and rooms built to absorb noise. Kitchens and laundries are positioned so heat and sound do not disturb the ceremonial spaces. Servant dining areas exist, but not to mirror comfort, only to sustain function. Bedrooms for staff exist, but not to promise privacy, only proximity. And yet, over time, This social order becomes harder to maintain, not because the building changes, but because the world outside does. As wages rise, as domestic service becomes less available, as social attitudes shift, an estate built to hide labor finds itself exposed by economics. A throne can survive scandal. It struggles against staffing reality. Because once hierarchy becomes expensive, it stops being tradition and starts becoming an unsolved operational problem. The Breakers was never a courthouse or a capital. It didn't need to be. In the Gilded Age, influence often traveled through proximity rather than ballots, through dinners, marriages, patronage, and the soft enforcement of belonging. Newport's season functioned as a sorting mechanism. To be present in the right houses at the right hours meant being treated as legitimate. To be absent meant being treated as optional. That legitimacy had consequences far beyond the shoreline. Rail fortunes were tied to national infrastructure. Decisions about expansion, pricing, labor, and finance rippled into towns and industries. Yet the people who held these decisions did not always present themselves as political actors. They presented themselves as private families. Newport offered an environment where those families could gather, compare, ally, and soften the edges of competition under the cover of leisure. A grand estate made that process easier. Large houses created controlled space where outsiders could be included in precisely managed ways, invited but not equal, welcomed but still placed. Networks formed not in public meetings but in repeated private contact. Trust was built through ritual, the same rooms, the same routes, the same codes of behavior that signaled discretion. This is how a mansion becomes a policy environment without written policy. And, as the 20th century advances, the relationship between wealth and the state tightens. Regulation grows. Tax structures evolve. Public scrutiny increases. Large fortunes still command access, but the conditions of access change. The elite can no longer treat the nation as a quiet backdrop. The nation begins to treat the elite as a visible subject. That is where the Breakers becomes politically important in a new way. Not as a place where laws are written, but as a symbol that must be explained. An emblem of inequality that cannot be hidden when the country is asked to sacrifice during war, during depression, during social upheaval. A palace on the Atlantic becomes a public argument, whether the owners want it to or not. And once a private home becomes a public argument, the next pressure arrives quickly. The need to justify the building's existence in financial terms rather than social ones. The Breakers was built to look like it would outlast its owners. That appearance is expensive. An estate like this does not decline in a single event. It declines through routines, repairs deferred, staffing trimmed, rooms closed, seasons shortened, projects postponed until next year. The building itself does not care about sentiment. Paint fails on schedule. Roofs age in storms. Plumbing corrodes. Stone cracks in cycles of moisture and cold. The ocean air works patiently, every day, regardless of who holds the deed. In the late 19th century, those costs were absorbable because the wealth feeding the mansion was expanding. In the 20th century, the math shifts. National crises change spending habits. Labor becomes more costly and less available for domestic service. Taxes and insurance become heavier. The idea of maintaining a private institution solely to host a season becomes harder to defend, even for the very rich. A mansion built to be occupied by a household begins to resemble a museum that happens to have family bedrooms. And the key difference between a home and a museum is revenue. A private house only consumes. A public house can, at least in theory, pay part of its own survival. That is the moment when preservation stops being an aesthetic choice and becomes an economic strategy. Opening doors, managing tours, controlling access, these are not sentimental acts. They are financial responses to a building that has become too large for private life and too famous to disappear quietly. This is the structural trap of the Gilded Age throne. The more iconic the house becomes, The harder it is to sell without backlash, and the harder it is to keep without surrendering privacy. Eventually, the only sustainable path is transformation, ownership shifting from family identity to institutional purpose. By then, the decisive turning point is never dramatic. It is paperwork, meetings, decisions made under pressure. A moment when a dynasty realizes the building can survive only if the dynasty steps aside. The decisive change at the Breakers does not begin with a collapse. It begins with a calendar that stops making sense. For decades, the house operates on a seasonal rhythm that feels as fixed as the tide. Late spring, preparations. Summer, arrivals, dinners, staff at full strength, rooms brought back to life. Early fall, shutdown, linens packed, silver stored, shutters tightened. The mansion was built to behave like a private institution that briefly pretends to be a family home. But the 20th century is not kind to institutions that exist only for display. By the time the 1930s arrive, the American economy has been through shocks that do not respect legacy. Even when a family remains wealthy, the structure of wealth is under pressure. Markets, taxation, labor costs, and the slow end of a domestic service world that once supplied households like this without bargaining power. In 1934, the property passes deeper into the branch of the family that will become central to the end of the private era. Gladys Vanderbilt Seycheny, the youngest child of Cornelius Vanderbilt II. She has already lived the logic of the place from inside it. She was raised with Newport as a seasonal capital, and with the Breakers as one of the family's most visible proofs. Now, it is not simply her childhood setting. It is an asset under her responsibility. From the outside, ownership still looks like permanence. Inside, it begins to resemble management. The house is massive, and mass is expense. Every year it stands, it demands money simply to remain stable. Stone holds the cold. Ocean air corrodes metal. Roof lines need constant attention. Interiors made to impress require specialized care. Even unused rooms are not free. They must be monitored, cleaned, protected against moisture, pests, and slow deterioration. Staff must be hired, coordinated, housed, and paid. The Breakers is too large to idle like an ordinary home. It can only operate fully, or retreat into partial shutdown, and the country itself is changing around it. By the late 1930s and early 1940s, the mansion's private meaning competes with a national mood that is becoming more collective, more mobilized, less tolerant of ceremonial excess. War is not only fought overseas, it is felt in schedules, rationing, public expectation, and the practical demand that large spaces justify themselves. At the Breakers, that justification becomes literal. The property is not occupied by Gladys and her family for stretches around the early 1940s. The mansion's scale makes it useful for civil defense planning, and the house is offered in 1942 for wartime purposes, briefly entering the public imagination not as an elite stage, but as a place of shelter logistics. In January 1943, it is used in a major civilian air raid drill, hundreds of wardens and volunteers moving through basements designed for storage and service, now reframed as protective infrastructure. These details matter because they shift the building's identity. A private house that can be used as an air raid shelter is no longer purely private. It has become too large to remain only personal. It has entered the realm of civic utility, even if temporarily, simply because the nation is now asking different questions of space and wealth. When the war years pass, the old Newport season does not return as it once was. The Breakers still stands, still magnificent, still capable of staging a world that seems untouched by modern anxieties. But behind the facade, the costs remain, and the pool of people willing to live a life of domestic service, hidden and total, continues to shrink. Wages rise, alternatives exist. The labor model that made these houses feel effortless begins to fail in small, practical ways. Fewer staff, higher turnover, harder recruitment, larger gaps between what the architecture expects and what a household can supply. The response is not a dramatic reinvention. It is an economic choice disguised as generosity. On June 10, 1948, an arrangement is announced that quietly changes the meaning of ownership. The breakers will be leased to the Preservation Society of Newport County for $1 per year, with public tours scheduled to begin on July 1, 1948. The initial adult ticket price is set at $1.25 plus tax, a number small enough to feel symbolic, yet real enough to become revenue. This is the moment the throne stops being solely dynastic. The arrangement is carefully structured. The Preservation Society operates tours and takes in ticket revenue. Gladys continues to shoulder major burdens: property taxes, insurance, and large repairs, meaning the family remains financially exposed even as the public begins to enter. The house becomes a hybrid: part private residence, part public exhibit, part preservation project. And that hybrid is the point. Opening the doors is not a surrender to curiosity. It is a strategy against the building's appetite. A great house can be admired into survival, but it cannot be loved into solvency. The only way to keep the structure intact is to attach it to a system that produces steady cash flow, and the only system available by then is the one that turns grandeur into admission. The change is subtle at first. A few rooms on the ground floor become the route. Visitors are guided through spaces that were once reserved for a narrow world of invitations. The building's ceremonial areas, Great Hall, dining room, the rooms built for arrival, become exactly what they were designed to be: stages. The difference is that the audience has changed. The breakers begins to serve not only as a family symbol, but as a public artifact. Over time, that fact reshapes everything. Once the house is opened, it cannot easily return to full privacy without becoming financially irrational again. Once visitors are admitted, the mansion's survival becomes linked to the visitor count, to staffing as an institution rather than as a household, and to maintenance as a publicly legible responsibility. The estate begins to behave less like inherited property and more like a museum that happens to contain a family apartment above. Gladys remains connected to the building until her death in 1965, but the trend line has already been set. The breakers now exists in two realities at once: a private name on the deed and a public presence in the town's economy. The house is no longer simply owned. It is operated. And when a house becomes something that must be operated, the next decision is rarely romantic. It is ownership, formal, complete, institutional, waiting to be resolved into a date. Once the breakers becomes public in 1948, the house enters a new phase that looks stable from the outside but is precarious in practice. It is easy to misread that moment as rescue. In reality, it is a compromise that delays a larger decision. The lease arrangement solves one problem immediately. The building begins to earn money from what it already is. People pay to see the rooms. The Preservation Society operates tours and builds an institutional routine around staffing, schedules, visitor flow, and interpretation. The mansion, designed for controlled movement, adapts unnervingly well to being guided. But the core burden does not disappear. A house like this still has major repairs that arrive whether or not the public is inside. Large systems fail in cycles. Roofs need replacement. Stone and masonry require ongoing restoration. Utilities age. Salt air continues its slow work, and even when a nonprofit runs the daily operations, ownership still carries a different weight. Taxes, insurance, legal responsibility, and the largest capital decisions that cannot be solved by ticket revenue alone. So the breakers remain suspended between two identities: a private home that has become a public site. A public site that is still privately owned. That suspension lasts because it is supported by a single human reality. As long as Gladys Vanderbilt Sechenyi is alive, the arrangement can continue in a form that feels personal. She maintains a private apartment in the house. She remains the human connection between an era of dynastic ownership and the new era of institutional stewardship. The public sees the rooms. The family still holds the deed. Then, in 1965, Gladys dies, and the structure loses its stabilizing center. What follows is not a fight in the open. It is the kind of decline that happens in boardrooms and family meetings, quiet, technical, and unavoidable. Her will divides the property among her descendants. The legal reality is clean on paper, but difficult in practice. Multiple heirs inherit not only a mansion, but a responsibility that cannot be shared easily. A house does not accept partial ownership the way a stock portfolio does. Someone has to make decisions. Someone has to sign. Someone has to absorb risk when the roof fails and the bill arrives. And more than that, the heirs inherit a timing problem. The Breakers has become famous. It has become a public landmark in everything but legal status. Millions of people have already walked through its principal rooms. The mansion has shifted in the public mind from private excess to shared heritage. That change is subtle, but it matters. Once the public believes a place belongs to it emotionally, private owners cannot sell it casually without becoming villains. At the same time, the public belief does not pay for repairs. This is where the story becomes tragic in the most American way, not through scandal, but through arithmetic. If the heirs keep the house, they inherit a continuing stream of costs and obligations, with no guarantee the building will ever behave like an asset. If they sell it privately, the buyer pool shrinks to almost nothing. Only a handful of people could afford the operating expense, and fewer still would want the public pressure that comes with owning a nationally famous symbol. If they break it apart, they destroy the very thing that makes it valuable. The mansion becomes what many elite estates eventually become: too large to keep, too prominent to discard. Meanwhile, the Preservation Society has been doing what institutions do. It has been building competence. It knows how to run tours. It knows how to staff the daily work. It has a growing infrastructure for maintenance and fundraising, and an organizational mission that can justify large preservation expenditures to donors and the public. It is not sentimental in the way an heir might be. It is structured to treat the mansion as a permanent project, and then, slowly, the center of gravity shifts. The Breakers remains open. The public keeps coming. The place becomes less a family possession and more a civic engine for Newport itself, drawing visitors, supporting local employment, feeding the town's tourism economy, and keeping Bellevue Avenue's cottage district alive as a functioning landscape of heritage. By the early 1970s, the final step is no longer shocking. It is simply the most logical endpoint. On December 28, 1972, the Preservation Society of Newport County purchases the Breakers from Gladys Vanderbilt Sechenyi's heirs for $365,000. The number is almost deliberately jarring, not because it was meaningless money at the time, but because it sits so far below what the building represents. It is a figure that exposes the central truth of these estates. Their symbolic value can be enormous, while their market value is restricted by their operating cost. You are not buying a house. You are buying an institution that must be funded forever. The terms surrounding the purchase reinforce that truth. The heirs do not simply hand over empty rooms. They gift much of the furniture and contents along with the property, because removing them would strip the house of its meaning and lower the public value that the Preservation Society is built to protect. The sale is not just a transaction. It is an orderly transfer of a complete world. Even the family's continued presence becomes formalized rather than personal. Under the agreement, one of Gladys's daughters, Countess Sylvia Sapari, is granted a life tenancy in the family's private apartment on the upper floor. The symbolism is quiet but sharp. The dynasty is permitted to remain as a resident, but only by permission of an institution that now holds the deed. The family is no longer sovereign within its own architecture. It is a tenant inside the monument it built. This is the moment the Gilded Age throne truly ends. Not when the original house burned, not when the tours began, but when ownership itself becomes institutional, when a private dynasty steps back and an organization steps in with a mission to preserve, interpret, and monetize the building's survival. What remains after that is not a home in the old sense. It is a property that must justify itself every year through budgets, maintenance cycles, staffing, restoration plans, and the steady pressure of weather. The mansion survives, but its meaning is rewritten, and once a throne becomes a museum, the consequences unfold over decades, not as drama, but as management. After December 1972, the Breakers does not become quieter. It becomes more legible. When a private family owns a mansion, the building's logic is concealed behind privacy. You may see the facade from the road, but you cannot see the expense, the staffing, the triage decisions. What is repaired this year, what is postponed, which rooms are closed, which systems are failing behind plaster. Ownership keeps the struggle invisible. Institutional control reverses that. Under the Preservation Society, the house is no longer allowed to drift in the dark. It must be scheduled, documented, interpreted, maintained in cycles that can be explained to boards, donors, auditors, and the public. The mansion becomes a public-facing organism whose survival depends on credibility, on proving that money spent becomes preservation achieved. The first consequence is operational. The house becomes a workplace. Not a private workplace run for one family, but a permanent operation with year-round staffing, training, maintenance routines, and visitor management. The old servant world is gone, but the building still needs hands. The difference is that those hands now belong to an organization with policies and payroll structures, not to a household with inherited authority. This change reshapes the daily rhythm. Tours require routes that protect fragile finishes. Visitor flow demands barriers, signage, supervision. Cleaning becomes conservation rather than housekeeping. Repairs become restoration. Slower, specialized, and expensive in ways that ordinary home repair is not. A museum house cannot use quick replacements without risking authenticity. It must preserve not only the structure but the surfaces that make the structure meaningful. The carved detail, the plasterwork, the textiles, the wood, the stone. The second consequence is financial. The mansion becomes a revenue engine. Ticket income does not make a building like this profitable in a conventional sense, but it does something crucial. It gives the house a predictable stream of money that can be planned against. That predictability changes how preservation is approached. Instead of deferring repairs indefinitely, the institution can set priorities: roof, masonry, mechanical systems, moving from crisis response to planned stewardship. And because the Breakers is the flagship, its success amplifies beyond its gates. Visitors who come for the Breakers often come for other houses, other tours, the broader Newport experience. Local businesses benefit: hotels, restaurants, shops, guides, seasonal staff. The mansion, once designed as a private symbol, becomes a public anchor for the town's tourism economy. It does the opposite of what it did in the Gilded Age. Instead of drawing labor quietly into a household, it draws money openly into a city. The third consequence is reputational. The Vanderbilt era becomes history instead of presence. Under private ownership, the family name functions like a living credential. Under institutional ownership, the name becomes a label, a story told in rooms. Interpretation replaces intimacy. The guide's script replaces the invitation. The visitors do not come as guests, they come as observers, and observation changes the balance of power. A throne is different when it is toured. Its authority weakens as soon as its secrets become educational material. The back stairs, the servant corridors, the logistics of heating and staffing. The public sees what the architecture was designed to hide. That exposure does not destroy the house, but it changes the kind of awe it produces. Admiration shifts from envy to analysis. Grandeur becomes evidence of a system rather than proof of a family, and yet, the dynasty does not vanish completely. The life tenancy granted to Countess Sylvia Sapari keeps a thread of private continuity alive in the upper floors, a reminder that this transition is not a clean break, but a negotiated shift. The family remains present, but not controlling. The private apartment becomes a small surviving territory inside a structure now governed by institutional rules. This is what the aftermath looks like in real time. Not rubble, not auction drama. A building that continues to stand, now supported by admissions, donors, and schedules. Its survival dependent not on inheritance but on public interest, year after year, season after season. And, over time, that survival produces a final transformation. The mansion stops being a symbol of one family's power and becomes an emblem of an entire era. Gilded Age. America itself, preserved by the very public that the era once excluded. Once the Breakers becomes a preserved public monument, the estate begins to exert power in a different direction. In the Gilded Age, it was an endpoint, the place wealth traveled to when it wanted to be seen. In the late 20th century, it becomes a source, the place history travels from, generating meaning, tourism, and a certain kind of civic identity that Newport can now sell to the world. That shift matters because it changes what the mansion is allowed to be. A private family can let rooms decay quietly, can close doors without explanation, can choose comfort over authenticity. An institution cannot. It must keep the building presentable, interpretable, and safe. It must be audited by public expectation, not only by private taste. Every year, the house is judged not by guests, but by crowds. The result is a steady escalation of preservation seriousness. Conservation becomes a craft. Decisions about materials, finishes, and repair methods are no longer casual. The work must match the era, respect the original design, and hold up under constant visitation. The Breakers' survival becomes a long negotiation between authenticity and durability, how to protect surfaces built for a few weeks of elite use from the feet and hands of the public. And that negotiation forces Newport itself to professionalize its relationship with the past. The mansion's success reinforces a broader model. The cottage district is not merely a collection of big houses, it is an economic ecosystem. When one property proves it can survive through institutional stewardship, other properties can be justified the same way. Preservation becomes less of a moral plea and more of a strategy. Save the architecture and you preserve an industry, jobs, taxes, the city's global visibility. This is the quiet irony of the aftermath. The mansion becomes sustainable by becoming useful. Tourism does what inheritance could not. It spreads the burden across thousands of visitors rather than a handful of heirs. Instead of one family paying for the roof and the heating and the repairs, the costs are distributed through admissions, donations, gift shop sales, and the broader economic activity that makes the Preservation Society's work politically and financially defensible. In this arrangement, the public becomes the new patron class, not in the old sense of lavish private spending, but in aggregate, millions of small payments, repeated across years. The Breakers becomes a building that survives because it can continually persuade people that its survival matters. That persuasion changes the tone of the story. The Gilded Age built the mansion to project dominance. The late 20th century preserves it to explain dominance. The same rooms now do opposite work. Instead of hosting the rituals of hierarchy, they reveal the mechanics of hierarchy. Guides point out the service corridors, the hidden staircases, the staff infrastructure that kept wealth looking effortless. The Breakers becomes a textbook written in marble and plaster, teaching visitors how unequal systems were physically arranged. This is where the Vanderbilt throne is most fully undone, not by destruction, but by transparency. The public is allowed to see the cost structure of grandeur. The very architecture that once insisted on permanence now serves as evidence of fragility, how quickly a private family can be overwhelmed by a building designed to require an army. Over time, the Vanderbilt name becomes less like a living force and more like a caption. In Newport's economy, the mansion becomes the product. The family becomes the story attached to it. The dynasty's power dissolves into interpretation. The heirs no longer decide what is shown, only what is remembered. And yet, the building still wins in its own way. The breakers remain standing. It remains imposing. Its stone facade continues to make visitors slow down. The wind off the Atlantic still moves across the lawns. The rooms still carry the hush of scale. The house continues to dominate not because a family commands it, but because the structure itself demands attention. This is the final outcome of the sale. The estate outlives the dynasty by changing owners, changing purpose, and changing the kind of power it represents. It becomes proof that in America, permanence is rarely inherited intact. It is renegotiated through institutions, through public interest, and through the slow conversion of private ambition into shared spectacle. And that leaves the last, quiet question beneath the whole story. If a throne can survive only by becoming a museum, what does that say about the kind of power that built it, and the kind of power that remains when the builders are gone? The Breakers still stands because it accepted a truth that most dynasties resist until it is too late. Power is not the same thing as permanence. In the 1890s, this house was built as a statement that wealth could be made to look like destiny. Stone replacing wood, scale replacing doubt, European forms replacing the discomfort of new money. A railroad fortune, born out of speed and consolidation, tried to freeze itself into architecture. The mansion did what it was designed to do. It made a family feel inevitable. But the 20th century introduced an enemy that marble cannot intimidate: ongoing cost. A great estate is not a single achievement. It is a continuing contract with labor, weather, law, and public mood. It requires a world that agrees to supply servants, to tolerate extravagance, to keep taxation and scrutiny light enough that private monuments can survive as private. When that world changes, the building does not argue. It simply sends the bill. That is why the last heirs are rarely villains. They are often the first generation forced to treat the symbol as an equation. By opening the house in 1948 and by selling it in 1972, the Vanderbilt line at the Breakers did something more honest than triumph. They admitted that the throne could not remain a throne. It could survive only by becoming something else: an institution, a museum, an economy, a lesson. Newport, in turn, reveals what happens when private power becomes public heritage. The same rooms once used to separate the included from the excluded now teach visitors how exclusion was built, how corridors hid labor, how scale manufactured awe, how leisure depended on a workforce that was never supposed to be seen. The mansion endures, but its meaning reverses. It no longer proves that one family was permanent. It proves that the system that created such families was temporary, brilliant, extractive, and fragile in the face of modern accounting. And on cold mornings, when the wind moves down Bellevue Avenue and the house appears as solid as ever, the quietest fact is also the sharpest. A century of power can end without a battle. It can end with a deed, a signature, and a building that remains, still beautiful, still imposing, no longer owned by the people who built it, but by the public they once kept outside.